Hello, everyone, and thank you very much indeed for being here. So I am Bernardo, a research fellow in classics here at Oxford. And I must say we are all very pleased that we are just about 50, I think. And I guess we would all agree that this is one of the advantages of holding events online. So welcome to this first installment of our Writing Orality seminar, which I think is very much in the spirit of the early text cultures project here at Oxford. Indeed, we aim at bringing together people working on similar themes across a variety of pre-modern cultures who would otherwise find it a bit hard to establish a dialogue with one another. I think the key here is the common shared set of questions and intellectual frameworks and the variety of answers, which always depend on the context. So I guess the general question we are asking in this reading group is how we are to identify and interpret orality in the textual sources of the past. And today we will begin by exploring the key concept of formula or formulaic expressions in the early Greek and ancient Hebrew contexts. While these concepts famously gave rise to the oral formulaic theory in Homeric studies, it is no less important that it was then extended not only to other pre-modern cultures, but it truly became a hallmark in other fields such as folklore studies, anthropology, and linguistics. So in order to facilitate interdisciplinary dialogue, there will be a unified debate after our talks. Our first speaker then is Martina Astrid Rodda, who's a lecturer in ancient Greek here at Oxford and is in the very final stages of completing her PhD thesis on a corpus study of formulaic variation and linguistic productivity in early Greek epic. I hope everybody has a handout, but if not, Flaminia will now paste a link to it in the group chat. So the floor is yours, Martina. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. So, and everyone for inviting me. So basically today's paper is an attempt to construct an overarching narrative across pretty much half of my PhD work, possibly a bit more, so no pressure whatsoever. I'm submitting in a couple of weeks, no stress. As you may have guessed by the fact that there are sparkle quotes in the paper title, it's very informal in presentation. I'm aiming to, basically there is no need for you to understand ancient Greek, to know Greek at all, or to know about Greek literature to understand this paper. If you do, there are a couple of points where you will probably just want to zone out a little because I'm saying things that are relatively well known, but I've tried to make it interesting for anyone independently of background. The results of this paper are the opposite of informal in that it's most of my PhD work. I will mostly talk about the theory background and the results and their implications rather than talking about methodology or quantitative analysis. I'm super happy to answer questions about that if they come up in the discussion, and I'm super happy to answer questions, especially if they resonate with Stephen's paper, which I know nothing about, so that's exciting. Hopefully we will not disagree on everything. So yeah. So, this is my PhD work. My PhD work focuses on language variation in early Greek epic, both on syntax and semantics, so how formulaic phrases change their shape, broadly speaking, and how meaning changes and how or whether you can substitute words of similar meanings in formulae. But today I'll only talk about syntax, and specifically I'll talk about language variation in formulae that are made by a noun plus an adjective referring to the noun itself. And I'll present some general features of the behavior of the structures and why we should care about them, which is always a good question. And finally, I'll try to show how later poetry, not just archaic epic poetry, exploits these formal conventions of formulaic language to create poetic effect. So that's the plan. First section, we'll talk about context and formulaic variation. What is a formula? Why is it important? Why does it vary? This is the part where you can probably zone out a little bit if you already know something about early Greek literature and epic. I'm going to try and make it engaging for classicists. I know there are classicists in the audience beyond, the organizers. So there are a few concepts in here for modern linguistics that are relevant and that you may or may not have heard about. So, don't go to sleep entirely. And if you do, please just turn your camera off. So, but yeah, so archaic Greek epic is the product of an oral tradition, of which the Homeric poems are the main remnant. We also have other stuff. When I say the product of an oral tradition, I'm not interested in getting bogged down in debates about how exactly they were composed, if they were composed entirely orally, or if they are just the product of a style that is oral enough that it can still plausibly pass as oral, even if it were composed with through the means of writing. I think my argument works either way. I think there are still significant differences, as we will see, compared to entirely written poetry. But yeah, our main testimonies of archaic Greek epic are the Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to Homer, the Theogony and Works and Days, attributed to a poet named Hesiod, who actually probably composed them, as opposed to Homer, and the Homeric hymns. And the topics of these poems ranged from the Trojan War to here's how you run a farm in 7th century BC mainland Greece. And also I have a lot of opinions. So this should make it clear that what makes archaic epic a genre is not the subject. It's actually the style of the poems. These were poems that were in some form performed orally and improvised by skilled bards. And these bards use a language that is made of building blocks that can be easily combined to construct poetic lines in a very highly structured meter, which is the hexameter meter. I will not be talking about meter in this paper, you're fine. But yeah, so to compose these lines on the fly, the easiest way is to have pre-made building blocks that kind of fit together. The kind of will be particularly important, and that can be reused in the same shape. These building blocks are called formulae, and the language which they build, we call a formulaic language. And this is basically oral formulaic theory in a tiny little nutshell. But yeah, formulae are only one of the devices that were developed to allow for easier composition, memorization, and understanding, but they're the one we're talking about today, so I guess we'll stick with this. Linguistically speaking, formulae are recurring language units that have limited flexibility in linguistic structure and meaning. So what I mean is that they tend to be repeated in something like the same form every time they appear. When I say something like the same form, obviously this is not a great operative definition, and this is exactly where the problems are going to start to arise, as we will see. What does it mean for something to appear in the same form? Does it need to be identical? What is it that identifies a formula as a formula? But before we get there, let's start from these examples, and you have a few of them on the handout. So we have noun epithet pairs, swift-footed Achilles, Agamemnon, Lord of Men. More people than Agamemnon can be Lord of Men. Achilles is the one that is most frequently swift-footed, but a couple of other people also get to be swift-footed sometimes. So these epithets can combine with different names. Or, without having a proper name in there, swift ships, the wine dark sea that most people know about. So this is the basic, smaller size formula. And then there are more complex phrases, things like speech introductions. And among them spoke Agamemnon, Lord of Men. That's one whole line. And if you look at it, it contains a name epithet formula, Agamemnon, Lord of Men, and then a formula that indicates starting to speak in an assembly, and among them spoke. So this is how you combine the building blocks to get a full poetic line. So I've been talking about oral formulaic theory without giving you any history, not least because I assume Stephen will do that possibly. Just keeping my fingers crossed for that. But yeah, so this traditional formulation, Homeric formulae are repeated phrases. They are definitely a sign of oral composition in some form. This was advanced in full by Milne and Perry for the first time, and then expanded, for the last century, literally. So I mentioned that formulae tend to be repeated in the same form, or at least in a form similar enough that allows them to be identifiable as this specific formula, as opposed to a different formula that kind of sounds like this. However, the problem is if you have pre-made building blocks and you're sticking them together, at some point you're going to end up in a situation where you need to adapt your building block to fit the syntax of the sentence you're trying to say. Like if you have a formula that says Agamemnon, Lord of Men in the nominative, and you want Agamemnon to be, hit by a spear, then the nominative doesn't work anymore, unless you want to go for a passive verb, and then you have all sorts of problems. So this all means that formulae can get inflected in case and number. For those playing at home, Greek has 5 cases and 3 numbers, so that's quite a lot, at least more than the average Semitic language, I guess. Also, formulae can admit additions of things that range from a preposition. Sometimes you want to say on the swift ships and not just the swift ships, or an extra adjective. Sometimes your ships are swift and black, or a particle. Greek has a lot of particles, and so on. All of these changes can do something that is quite problematic, which is change the metrical structure of a formula. So you have a building block in a specific shape, which normally fits a specific place in the hexametral line. And then you change its shape and you have to move it somewhere else. And also this can also work in reverse. Sometimes you have a building block, you have a formula that would fit perfectly in a specific position in the line, but you, hypothetical archaic Greek bard, have already filled that position with something else. And so you need to get your formula to fit in a different place in the line, which sometimes means changing its shape. If you're working from a 100% like hard parist approach, so if you're trying to define a formula as a repeated structure, this creates a problem. Formulae are not exactly phrases that regularly occur in the same metrical position to express the same meaning, which is more or less how Parry defined them, because we can move them around, so they don't necessarily fit the same metrical position. They can take a slightly different shape. Yes, they express the same meaning if we keep the same words, but that's a whole other kettle of fish that I'm not going to touch here. So what makes a formula if this definition doesn't quite cover all of those cases? Milman-Parry's traditional approach was kind of like this. If a bard has a name epithet formula in a specific case of a specific metrical shape, and they want to use it in a different case that would change its metrical shape, then what they will do is actually change the epithet so they can maintain the same metrical shape. They can have a building block of the same size. So I've given you some examples of this. So if you want to change nea melainan, which means black ship, but in the accusative, to nei melaine, which means black ship in the dative, that's fine, they have the same metrical shape. If you want to put it in the genitive, then that wouldn't work with the same adjective. And so you need to build something like neos eises, which is the well-built ship. And this still has the same metrical shape as the previous two, it just uses a different adjective. Okay, but this is clearly not all that goes on with formulae, especially with formulae that are made of an adjective plus a noun. For instance, you end up dealing with objects such as, nei melaine in the dative again, or epinei melaine. All of these are on the handout, at least I hope. So on the black ship with a preposition, and this does change the metrical shape, you're adding an entire syllable to it. Or sometimes you find something like, neos proparoite melaines, which is just like wildly different from a metrical point of view. It means in front of the black ship. It's still a black ship. There is still some level of connection between the melas, the black adjective, and the ship, the noun. So are they on some level the same formula? How do we define a kind of formula that can take all of these different shapes? The answer is provided by John Bryan Hainsworth in a 1968 book that was actually his doctoral thesis. And his answer is extremely interesting from a linguistic standpoint. So Hainsworth says, the thing that defines a formula is the fact that there is a relation between the noun and the adjective that create the formula, if we're talking about noun-adjective pairs, which is what we're doing right now. This relation he calls mutual expectancy, which means that you've seen the noun and adjective together enough times that you learn that when you find one, you're kind of about to find the other. There are different degrees to this. So ships are normally black, swift, concave, well-built. There's a limited range of adjectives that can go with that. Achilles is divine, swift-footed, bunch of other epithets. So when a listener hears the word ships, they may expect one of the usual adjectives to come with it. And this expectation is not dependent on whether the noun and adjective occur in a specific case or in a specific metrical position, not even in a specific order. And the interesting thing about this definition is that it looks a lot like something that happens in everyday language, not just in, ye old Greek epic. Sometimes there are words that occur so often together with other words that we automatically expect the second part of the phrase when we see the first one. So you're writing an email, you're ending your email, you may want to write best wishes. We know that best is always wishes or regards. And so you can easily just use the shortened version best, and that's fine. If you're using a different email closing formula, with all my gratitude, that's a bit old-fashioned, but that's fine. You can't just say with all my, comma, because that's too open. There's not an established formula. There isn't that level of expectation between the two parts. The flip side of this is that these linguistic phenomena, which we call bound expressions or collocations, more complex cases of these we call idioms, but that's normally an entire phrase. These phenomena show a range of restrictions to their syntactic behavior, which also matches what happens in Greek formulae. So if you're doing best wishes, my best wishes, very best wishes, that's all fine. The best wishes, I don't like it. That doesn't sound really grammatical. Best regards is great. Kind regards is great. Best and kind regards, no, you're overdoing it. So a lot of these restrictions are arbitrary from a purely syntactic standpoint. Best and kind regards is an okay phrase, it works. They are, of course, determined by linguistic usage, and they can be more or less rigid depending on what the usage requires. And in the same way, formulae can be more or less flexible depending on the requirements of hexameter poetry. Cool. Why are we talking about all of this? What does all of this comparing with linguistic definitions earn us? Well, it means that we can think about formulae in early Greek epic in similar ways as we think of bound expressions. And one of the things that is particularly interesting when you're looking at bound expressions is figuring out what types of variation are allowed and which types of variations are not allowed. And if in some way these restrictions guide our conception of what is a set phrase, what is a bound expression rather than what isn't. So best wishes is a set phrase, all my gratitude is not. So my work is based on a study of English idioms by Stephanie Wolf, 2008. She takes a bunch of idiomatic phrases that are made of a verb and a direct object. So something like hit the hay, go to bed. And she compares them to the behavior of non-idiomatic verb plus object phrases. So hit a target, for instance, which literally means hit a target. And Wolf is looking specifically at types of variation, which can be, changes in tense, changes in, is there an article, is there no article, that sort of thing. Types of variation that are very common in normal baseline non-idiomatic phrases, but they're not allowed in idioms. So for instance, if you have hit a target versus hit the hay, you can absolutely say, he was hitting the hay. Okay, it's kind of awkward, but that's fine. And he was hitting a target. So changing the tense is okay. But you can't, for instance, put it in the passive. A target was hit means a target was hit. The hay was hit doesn't mean someone went to bed. It means someone, kicked a bale or something like that. Yeah, so that's the sort of issue that we run into. So some of these transformations are totally fine, both on idioms and not idioms. Some of these transformations are absolutely okay on not idioms, and they're not okay on idioms. Some of these may be weird and awkward in both cases. Passive imperative, may the hay be hit, may the target be hit. That's just weird. It doesn't matter if it's an idiom or not. So how can we apply this to Greek formula? Well, I didn't look at verb plus object phrases because that's a mess. I looked at noun adjective pairs like Hainsworth did. So I took a set of noun adjective pairs in archaic Greek epic, which we presume to be formulaic because they occur a high number of times as a pair, specifically more than 20 times. So there is what Hainsworth thinks of as mutual expectation. And we compare the syntactic behaviors to the behavior of normal noun adjective pairs in a non-formulaic corpus. And I'm interested in three main areas of variation. Variation that involves the addition of something. So swift black ships, on swift ships, preposition, adjective, particle, doesn't matter. Variation in case or number, and variation that involves changes in word order or separation between the noun and adjective. And I think I put those on the handout. I truly hope I did. And when we compare how epic formulae behave along these three axes of variation, so addition, case and number, word order, to the behavior of non-formulaic phrases, we find that one of these categories does not behave like the other two. So when it comes to addition of stuff, that is almost as easily permitted in formulaic phrases as it is in non-formulaic ones, sometimes even more easily. While if we want to change case or word order, this is significantly harder in formulaic pairs than it is in non-formulaic ones. So restrictions to variation in case, word order, and separation is characteristic of formulaic phrases, while expansion with additional material does not significantly distinguish formulae from non-formulae. There are a couple of more interesting things that appear across the board. You will notice I'm skipping the table. The table is for you to look at and sort of make sure that I'm not actually lying, but it says what I just said. There are a couple of interesting extra things that happen. Formulae that appear more frequently are on average more flexible, which is interesting because it tells us that formulae are not mechanically memorized and repeated, because if they were just repeated, they're like more frequent formulae would actually be more deeply entrenched in linguistic terms, so more memorized, which is what, for instance, Albert Lord, another of the proponents of oral formulaic theory, thinks happens. So phrases are repeated and therefore they become more rigid and they become more formulaic. That's clearly not true. What happens is that if you repeat a phrase, you end up running into more occasions for it to have to change, and so it changes more frequently. The other thing that happens, which I think is really neat, is that formulae that involve some specific adjectives are more flexible. And these adjectives are indefinites, specifically other, another, and all, each. Each of these is one word in Greek, but there's one word that means other or another, and another that means all or each. So allos and pas for the Greek speakers. And these adjectives have long been recognized as the site where a major innovation happens in on a linguistic level in ancient Greek. That's where articles start being used. And we've always explained that as, because you need an article to distinguish between the other guy and another guy. These are two different things. However, this is not enough to explain the fact that they're more flexible overall in all parameters of variation, not just when you're looking at articles. And the best explanation I have is that these adjectives are very light in meaning. They combine very easily with a lot of potential nouns. And that means that they create less of a bond of mutual expectation in the way that Hainsworth put it. I think that's really cool, but you may want to disagree. I had promised something about later epics, so I'm just gonna very quickly go through that and then finish. Here's the thing, we may think, okay, but why should we care about all of this? This is clearly the imposition of a modern standard. So what types of variation do we have? In the same way as we study English idioms quantitatively, we can do the same for Homeric formulae, but no one would have dreamed to do that in antiquity. They didn't even think of formulae as formulae, perhaps. People may disagree on this. So it is actually fairly clear that, for instance, Hellenistic scholars cared about repetition in the Homeric poems, and they tried to integrate repetition in their approach to textual criticism. So does this phrase need to be repeated in the same form every time, or are we allowed to have some variation? Do we have to change it if it appears with some variation? So that's really interesting. But the most interesting thing is that if we look at later epic, specifically Hellenistic epic, we're talking about 500 years after Homer, and we're talking about a guy called Apollonius of Rhodes, who is writing a much shorter poem that's about the story of the Argonauts, and so Jason and company. And he's definitely writing, he's not improvising orally. And for this reason, among other reasons, he uses language in a way that tends to avoid formulaic repetition. And people have said, his language promotes what, by the standards of archaic epic, is artificial variation. What does this mean? Well, he really likes to bend the patterns that we saw at work in archaic formulae. He does it on a micro level. So for instance, the most frequent formula in my Homeric sample is swift ships. So the adjective means swift plus the adjective plus the noun that means ships. It's also the most, but basically the most flexible one of the most flexible ones. Apollonius uses this formula 5 times, which is very it's a high number for him, like the highest number of repetitions of the same pair, it's 8. So like this is repeated, but he always uses it in the same form. 4 times as nea thoen, so swift ship in the accusative, and once with an addition of a preposition onto the swift ship. So this is the most flexible one in Homer, the least flexible one in Apollonius. One of the most rigid ones, one of the most rigid formulae in early epic. It's a formula that means the whole, like every day, emata panta. And this is always used in the same form, despite the fact that it has the adjective whole, all pass, which should promote flexibility. So this is actually an outlier. Apollonius takes the same formula. What does it do with it? He always uses it in combination with various adjectives, including numerals. And he likes to move the formula around. So instead of like every day, just like, 420 whole days, that sort of thing. So again, most flexible formula is the least flexible in Apollonius. Least flexible formula is the most flexible in Apollonius. Does he have my numbers? Obviously not, but he does have a feeling that this phrase can vary a lot. And so I'm gonna be more Homeric than Homer and actually keep it very rigid. This phrase is very rigid, so I'm gonna be all innovative and change it every time it appears. He has a sense of this. Also, what he does is he changes the patterns of variation in formulae. So types of variation that affected word order, separation, they're very uncommon in Homer. That's what I was saying at the beginning. Well, not at the beginning, about halfway through the paper actually, but yes. Well, in Apollonius, most of the time, noun plus adjective phrases that are repeated relatively frequently, they're actually more flexible on average in word order than normal noun adjective phrases in non-epic material are. So our baseline phrases. This is clearly a poetic choice. Moving words around in the line is difficult. Moving words around in the line is a thing that Homeric bards do not do. And therefore Apollonius, who composes in writing, you can take it as a display of skill. You can take it as a way of distancing himself from the epic tradition, which is a slightly different thing. He's clearly doing something with it. So both of these examples, I think, so both what Apollonius does on individual formulae and what he does on general patterns, they show how a Hellenistic poet like Apollonius was actually very interested in the mechanisms of formulaic variation. Although, of course, he would not have thought of this as formulaic variation. He didn't have a concept of formulae. And this is interesting, I think, when we think about the transition between oral and written epic. So what does it mean to be a poet who works in writing and wants to distance himself from the archaic Homeric model? Does this prove that the archaic Homeric model was oral? I don't think it does. I just think it was just stylistically markedly different. And also it tells us that the kind of linguistic research that I do, which is weird stuff that involves statistical measures of variation, such as entropy, can actually pick up on patterns that would have been recognizable on some level to a native speaker, not just of ancient Greek, but of poetic Greek. So just to recap very quickly, formulae behave like all linguistic structures. They have some behaviors on which they behave in a very weird way, and they have some areas in which they do not behave in a particularly weird way. So there's a gradient of more unique to less unique behavior. We can look at what elements of this behavior are more salient in characterizing formulae. And this is not only relevant to linguistic analysis, but it's something that ancient authors could also play with for poetic effect, especially at a time where genre, well, the epic genre specifically, is being redefined in a literary environment that uses writing and reading as the primary medium, which is what happens with Apollonius. That's me. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. That was great. Well, I would already have some things to ask you, but we need to move on to our second speaker, who is Stephen Coleman, and he's the assistant professor of Old Testament and biblical languages at Westminster Theological Seminary. He obtained his PhD in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literatures at the Catholic University of America, Washington, D.C. in 2016. And he'll be talking to us about intimations of orality in the Hebrew Psalter. So the floor is yours, Stephen.
Thank you, Bernardo, and thank you also to the ETC board for this opportunity. This is great to be here. Thank you all also for coming out. I look forward to discussing these papers, and thank you, Martina, for that engaging presentation. I feel like the lines of connection to my work are legion, and I look forward to perhaps discussing a bit with you after. As I mentioned to the organizers, this paper is an abbreviated and somewhat modified version of an article I published a couple years ago with biblical interpretation, and represents in some portions some development of my thought on the matter of orality and oral formula in the Hebrew Psalms. The great literary critic Harold Bloom has written extensively on what he calls the anxiety of influence. And that is a poet's struggle to overcome and cast off the influence of their poetic forebearers, so that the poet might sing their own song and produce a wholly original composition. While the poets who produced the biblical Psalms evidence much by way of poetic influence, using exact or similar word pairs, phrases, epithets, images, patterns, and more, they seem to exhibit very little by way of anxiety about it. In fact, the poetry of the Psalter is at times so conventional that one wonders if a concern over originality, much less an anxiety about it, is only a feature of poets writing in predominantly literate cultures. But that's a question for another time. To be sure, the Hebrew Psalms do at times demonstrate extraordinary literary sophistication and creativity. The parallelism, imagery, metaphor, rhythm, assonance, poetic structure is arguably unrivaled in ancient literature. Nevertheless, alongside this remarkable literary artistry are surprisingly conservative and repetitive modes of expression. Ha'azina Adonai kol tachanuna. Heed, O Lord, the voice of my supplication occurs no less than 7 times in Psalms 86:6, 28:2, 66:19, 31:23, 6:9, 28:6, and Psalm 140, verse 7. During the last half of the 20th century, a number of biblical scholars considered the formulaic language and patterns of the Psalms with reference to the oral culture in which they were produced. And since the groundbreaking research just mentioned on oral composition of Homeric epics begun by Milman Parry in the 1920s and 30s, and then elaborated and refined by his student, Albert Lord, since that time, scholars have become increasingly aware of how predominantly oral cultures conceive, compose, hear, and at times record their literature differently than predominantly literate cultures. Now, there can be little doubt that the Hebrew Psalms were composed, however they were composed in a predominantly oral culture. And so naturally, the discovery of an oral mode of literary conception raises the possibility that the Psalms, as well as other biblical literature, may have been misread at times due to the literate bias of their interpreters. Though the Psalms come to us in written form, naturally, their writtenness does not prevent them from evidencing linguistic and formal strategies peculiar to oral conception, though not necessarily oral composition. Susan Nidich, old biblical scholar, frames the question facing students of ancient oral traditional literature well when she says, quote, The students of classical Greek and Anglo-Saxon literatures, like biblicists, work with rich and complex traditional style material that resonates with the aesthetics of oral composition, but that has been handed down, preserved, possibly even composed in written form. And that has existed in written form for centuries. What are the boundaries on the oral literate continuum that allows this literature to exist in writing while seeming to breathe with the aesthetics of an oral culture? The question therefore arises, how did the oral culture in which the Psalms were produced and performed influence their composition, inscripturation, and reception? Furthermore, how should this inform the interpretation of these poems? That is, how does the oral mode of conception affect the aesthetics of psalmic poetry? So in this paper, I want to examine just one characteristic of oral literature, what we're talking about, the oral formula, and argue that the oral formula in the Hebrew Psalter is best understood as a linguistic register. A linguistic register which achieves its meaning primarily through the process of traditional referentiality, which I'll describe later. So after a brief overview of the history of the study of orality in biblical literature, with special reference, of course, to the Psalms, I'll suggest a new method for identifying and classifying oral formulas based on prototype theory developed in the cognitive sciences. And then I'll summarize the conclusions of my analysis of two common and representative examples of oral formula, the plea formula and the praise formula. And then I'll offer a new proposal for evaluating the poetic function of psalmic oral formula based on this notion of linguistic register and traditional referentiality, which is developed by James Miles Foley. So first, brief history and new directions. Biblical scholars have been talking about oral tradition long before the Perry-Lord hypothesis. However, the oral formulaic theory of composition proposed by Perry and Lord provided biblical scholars with a new method to approach this old question of the influence of tradition on the biblical literature as we have it. So on analogy with the Perry and Lord hypothesis, initial investigations of orality in biblical literature focused on the question of composition. This is what everyone wanted to know. Does oral formula indicate composition in performance? The hope was that the evidence of oral composition would provide a window into how, where, and why the Psalms were composed. However, Hebrew poetry does not contain discernible meter, and so obviously requires a different approach than Greek or Old English poetry. And theories quickly divided into two competing schools of thought. One school proposed word pairs, words occurring together, usually in parallel lines. Others proposing repeated phrases as meeting the Perry-Lord criteria for an oral formula. However, neither proposal succeeded in providing unambiguous results, at least with regard to the stated goal of discovering oral composition. Robert Culley, who did some of the initial work in this area, helpfully summarizes the state of the question that resulted from all of these studies in orality of Hebrew poetry. He says, features like conformity to meter, formulaic density, and thrift, which made the theory convincing for Homer and Yugoslav poetry, are lacking in Hebrew poetry, since Hebrew meter has never been described, and the length of the line, while apparently subject to limitation, is rather flexible. Coote, who's another scholar working in this area, says Coote wonders why Hebrew oral poets might need stock language. In addition, formulaic density is difficult to establish in any substantial way due to the paucity of comparative material, nor can thrift be measured. The result is that while one may make a good case for conventional language in the Psalms and Job, it cannot be demonstrated positively that this language was functional in oral composition. They basically hit a dead end. Though attempts to prove oral composition of biblical Hebrew poetry yielded modest results at best, these early studies of orality in Hebrew poetry did succeed in proving one thing that would become central for future studies of orality, namely that a substantial amount of Hebrew poetry is comprised of conventional or traditional language. The ubiquity of traditional language, which was originally studied to answer the question of the mode of composition, right? Was it composed with writing or orality? Is here in this paper being revisited to shed light on a broader question of how these poems were conceived and understood in performance. This shift in focus, I think, reflects what is widely regarded as a significant development and a refinement of the Perry-Lord hypothesis, specifically the rejection of a strict dichotomy between oral and literate traditions. This is the so-called Great Divide, as described by Walter Ong, Jack Goody, and others. But in contrast to Ong and Goody, who argue for this sharp distinction between sort of these pure literate cultures, or I'm sorry, oral cultures, oral literature, and written literature, subsequent students of oral literature propose the existence of written literature which employs language or poetic devices proper to oral literature. To do this, a distinction is made between a linguistic medium, written and oral, and the linguistic conception, written and oral. Arguing that, quote, the conceptional aspect of language must be strictly differentiated from the medium aspect of language, Wolf Osterreicher says, quote, the conceptional profiles of any discourse are, as a matter of principle, independent of the medium of discourse. Similarly, Nidich speaks of, quote, writing in the oral mode and, quote, style indicative of oral style aesthetics. It understandably complicates the matter, but I think is more accurate to things on the ground. And so in place of this binary model of oral versus literate cultures and literatures, a more nuanced taxonomy has been proposed along with a descriptive model which takes into account the particularities of the variety of oral traditions, as well as the reality of the coexistence and interaction of textual and oral traditions within a particular culture. To be sure, this refinement of the oral formulaic theory does not deny the distinction between oral and literate traditions, but merely provides the distinctions and categories necessary for describing the vast and varied literary traditions, which may be regarded as in some way oral. So this conclusion makes the prospect of determining with certainty whether an ancient work of literature was the product of oral or written composition even more remote. It does raise the important question of how these works were conceived by their authors and received by their audiences as orally conceived literature. To put it another way, as a consequence of this distinction between the medium and the conception of a work, the question facing students of oral literature, including biblicists, shifts from how was oral literature composed to how does orally conceived literature mean or achieve meaning? This question, as it pertains to the Psalmic oral formula, will be taken up at the conclusion of this paper. But second, how do we identify oral formula in the Hebrew Psalter? Right? Before an analysis of oral formulas is even possible, one needs to determine what constitutes a formula at all. This is, to my mind, fundamentally a question of categorization. At first, the identification of oral formulas in Hebrew poetry was significantly influenced by Perry's famous definition of a formula as, quote, a group of words which is regularly employed under the same metrical conditions to express a given essential idea, unquote. In an attempt to modify Perry's criteria to fit Hebrew poetry for which there's no discernible meter, right? So that doesn't work. Coleman defines the formula as, quote, a repeated phrase, a line or a colon long, unquote. And a formulaic system for Coleman is described as, quote, phrases that have the same essential syntactic structure and at least one major lexical item in common, unquote. So Coleman's restriction to a formula to a word-for-word repeated phrase was necessary for his attempt to isolate evidence for oral composition. However, recent studies have demonstrated the inadequacies of such a mechanical or schematic approach to identifying oral formulas. In his study of the traditional phrase in Homer, Michael Nagler argues that the Perry-Lord conception of formulas as more or less closed systems needs to be replaced with a conception of the traditional phrase as an open-ended family of phrases. An open-ended family, for Nagler, is where, quote, each phrase in the group would be considered an allomorph, a derivative, not of any other phrase, but of some pre-verbal mental but quite real entity underlying all such phrases at a more abstract level. This pre-verbal template, which can be realized in a variety of traditional phrases, Nagler calls Gestalt. Nagler's notion of an open-ended family of phrases that exist at a pre-verbal mental level closely approximates the theory of prototypes developed in the cognitive sciences, especially in the fields of psychology and linguistics. First advanced by Eleanor Rosch in psychology and then applied to linguistics by George Lakoff and others, the theory of prototypes challenges the classical Aristotelian model of mental categorization with its criteria of necessary and sufficient conditions for category membership. Rosch's groundbreaking experiments demonstrated, contra the classical model, that not all members of a category have equal status, but rather members of a category are more or less representative or central than others. And so according to prototype theory, categories are gradient, with central or core members being good representatives of the category and peripheral members being less good representatives. A common example would be the category of chair, for which a four-legged piece of furniture, usually with a seat and a back, maybe with arms, is a good example of this category. Stools, high chairs, car seats, and bean bags would be less good instances of a prototypical chair. Prototype theory offers a more useful approach for the issue of identifying the traditional phrase in the Psalms. For example, Cully, working with the Perry-Lord definition of formula, identifies the following as distinct formulas representing unique and separate formulaic systems. So for example, Psalm 54:4, I'll just give these to you in English. O God, hear my prayer, occurring 5 times. But in Psalm 55:2, we have heed, O God, my prayer, occurring 4 times. Heed my prayer, 3 times. Hear, O Lord, my voice, 3 times. And as I mentioned at the beginning, heed, O Lord, the voice of my supplication, 7 times. Each of these Cully classifies as different formula. However, from the perspective of prototype theory and the model of conceptualization and categorization, these 6 should probably be grouped together as instantiations of a single plea prototype, based on their similarity in form, lexical and syntactical, based on their semantics and pragmatics. These are probably examples of the central members of the category of a plea formula. And so they could be regarded as the best examples of this category. The formulas I just gave to you in Hebrew have clear similarities. They contain an imperative related to hearing. Most contain a divine name as a vocative. All contain a reference to the psalmist's petition as a direct or indirect object. And to this group could be added other seemingly related formulas, though because of their deviation from the central members, could be considered less good instances of a prototype. Let me just give a few to you. These, I believe, are listed on the handout that was provided for you as well. I cry aloud to the Lord. I call to you, O Lord. I lift my soul to you, O Lord. Let my cry come to you and incline your ear to me. Each of these less good members deviates from the more frequent or central uses, either lexically or syntactically or both. Now, this is admittedly only one way to construe the data from the perspective of prototype theory. It is perhaps equally possible that what we have here are two or more different prototypes at work, each with more or less good representatives. The salient point, however, for my argument is simply that identifying and analyzing oral formula from the perspective of prototypes allows for grouping of lexically and syntactically different formula together according to their perceived resemblance to a prototype. Now, I'm going to skip over the data. We can come back to that in our discussion if you'd like. I want to give you the conclusions of the data, and then an avenue for understanding the function of oral formula. I looked at the plea formula and the praise formula. The plea formula was just rehearsed for you a bit in those illustrations I gave. But here I want to give a survey of the conclusions and then some avenues for understanding the function. If one rejects the largely anachronistic explanation of scribal copying, then the similarity of traditional phrases that occur throughout the Psalter can most naturally be explained with reference to orality and the traditional language that pervades the poetry of oral cultures. So let me begin with negative conclusions. It seems clear that oral formulas are not employed to fit certain metrical exigencies. Of the formulas considered, most fit the type, a typical 3 or 4 stress pattern, and from a metrical point of view, could often be interchanged with one another. The differences between the various instantiations of a prototype are better explained with references to the demands of parallelism and style than to fixed meter. Furthermore, it is clear from the variety of forms and distribution of the plea and praise formulas that oral formulas do not structure a poem. While Gunkel was correct to speak about fixed linguistic forms, he was wrong to connect such forms to what he called patterned genres. The use of a formula does not necessarily signal a shift from one strophe to another. It does not regularly begin a strophe or end a strophe, though it can do either. And so in this regard, its use appears arbitrary, and from a structural perspective, it appears optional. Nor, based on the evidence, could it be argued that oral formulas per se signal a type of poem being performed for an audience, whether a lament or thanksgiving or hymn or any other. Such signaling is, in fact, a typical function of the formula in oral poetry. However, the plea formula, generally associated with the lament psalm, also appears in hymns, thanksgiving psalms, and wisdom psalms. Likewise, the praise formula, often associated with hymns, occurs in thanksgiving psalms, historical psalms, and even laments. As will be demonstrated below, a signaling is not entirely absent from the oral formulaic language, but the salient point is that it does not function to signal a specific psalmic genre. Finally, the presence or preponderance of oral formulas cannot be regarded as an indicator of the relative age or date of composition of the Psalms. That is to say that Psalms with more formulae are not necessarily composed earlier than those with few or no formulae. Regarding cultures in transition between oral and literate stages, David Carr has observed, quote, that various means are often employed to preserve the tradition, to harden it over against the now visible process of cultural variation across time. As a result, formulae and other features of oral communication may actually be used more intensively with the onset of writing than with non-literate composition, transmission, and performance, unquote. In other words, the increased use of oral formulas could be a mechanism to preserve a tradition that is being perceived as fading due to the spread of literacy. Okay, well then, positively, I would suggest that the oral formula is a linguistic register proper to Israel's cultic worship and probably temple ritual. That is to say, the oral formula is a traditional idiom established and evolved over time, which became a proper and accepted a way of expressing certain sentiments and emotions, especially religious ones. John Miles Foley defines register as, quote, a dedicated, unified language exclusively devoted to communication in the performance arena. Foley's notion of linguistic register sheds light on the function of oral formula in orally derived literature. He argues that orally conceived verbal art conveys meaning differently than literately conceived verbal art, and by means of what he calls traditional referentiality. This ability of traditional phraseology and structures to convey meaning by invoking a larger shared extra-textual tradition he calls metonymy. Metonymy is, quote, designating a mode of signification wherein the part stands for the whole, unquote. Therefore, according to Foley, traditional and often repeated elements of orally conceived literature, so phraseology, themes, and story patterns, can be said to have an inherent rather than a conferred meaning. This distinction between an inherent and conferred meaning is pretty critical, and Foley deserves to be quoted at length here. He writes that in the modern literary work of art, we place the highest priority on a writer's personal manipulation of original and inherited materials, rewarding the work that strikes out boldly in a new direction by providing a perspective uniquely its own and memorable because it is new and fresh, or because of, best of all, because it is inimitable. In such a case, the work is praised for the finesse with which the author, not a tradition, confers meaning on his or her creation. If his or her text also draws meaning from literary tradition, it does so only through the careful intercession of the author, who is responsible not only for what the text encodes, but also for how the encoding takes place. In contrast, he writes, a traditional work depends primarily on elements and strategies that were in place long before the execution of the present version or text, long before the present nominal author learned the inherited craft, because the idiom is metonymic, summoning conventional connotations to conventional structures. We may say that the meaning it conveys is principally inherent. Okay, so to be sure, immanent and conferred meanings are not exclusive forms of expression. They exist on a continuum, with orally conceived literature relying more heavily on inherent forms of expression, and literately conceived literature relying more heavily on conferred forms. Clearly, the oral formulaic idiom was not the only way an oral poet was permitted to express himself or herself. The oral formulas in the Psalms are often surrounded by unique expressions of the same emotion or sentiments, and sometimes those same sentiments were expressed without the use of an oral formula at all. Often, however, the psalmists desire to combine their novel expressions with the traditional idiom of oral formula. This can largely be explained in terms of the nature of oral poetry and the way such poetry achieves its meaning in performance. Okay, there's more that could be said there, but I realize I'm out of time. Let me just jump straight to a conclusion, and perhaps we can discuss more about traditional referentiality if you'd like in the Q&A. By way of conclusion, that the Psalms were composed in and for a predominantly oral culture has profound importance for how these ancient poems should be read and interpreted. In many ways, oral poetry achieves its meaning through devices that are quite foreign to literate audiences. And in this paper, I've argued that the oral formula is one such device whose poetic function lies primarily in its capacity to evoke a common tradition between poet, performer, and audience, and also a common space with which those utterances became associated, probably the temple and temple worship. The oral formula exhibits remarkable flexibility in its usage, being able to be adapted to a variety of poetic exigencies. However, the basic prototype of the oral formulas remains recognizable even to readers as opposed to hearers of the Psalms. It is likely that they would have been more recognizable to an audience whose sensibilities to such oral signals have been cultivated over years. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed, Stephen, And so again, I guess we can now start with our unified debate. Please remember the ground rules. You should write in the chat, in the group chat, either new question or follow-up question. Obviously, follow-up questions will be privileged, and obviously as well, our two speakers need not write in the chat in order for them to speak. So I think there was indeed a lot in common between your approaches, even though your material is in fact quite different. I think we could outline 3 ways in which your approach is to some extent common, as I said. Both of you have somewhat moved away from the issue of how these texts were composed. So you're not that interested in that, and one wonders how far you think it is a dead end. In fact, instead you take an audience reception approach, and then both of you rely on methods or ideas drawn from linguistic or cognitive sciences approaches. So I guess there is a lot to talk about here. We as a group are interested in similarities as much as we are in differences. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions for our speakers. Does anyone want to start? Right. So I think there is a question from Paul. So he have written it down, but you want to say it yourself, Paul? Okay, so I don't see Paul, so I'm going to read it for him. So he's asking whether do you see repetitions being used to structure text, and especially to bring pericopes into parallel? So I guess if
is that one for me?
I suspect this one's for you because it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fine. Yeah, I think within some psalms, it is clear that repetition is used to structure the psalm, and but there's also a performative aspect to that as well. You don't want to, I think, pit those against. That'd be a false dichotomy. I think that there's a performance aspect that it's to also inform how the psalm was to be used in worship. However, more at a general level, the evidence and the data for are these formula usually used to structure a psalm, the evidence is not there. You can find them anywhere. And that was part of the legwork I did. I largely drew on Cully's data. He had done the yeoman's work of pulling all the data together of where do these formulas appear. But when you start looking at where they appear within a psalm, they don't seem to, at least predictably or exclusively, serve to structure a psalm. And that's in part what was motivating the study, is to say, well, then what are they for? I don't know if you have a follow-up on that, or if that answered the question.
Thank you. I think now we have a question from Samira. But before that, can I ask everyone if you could please speak out loud your questions if you feel comfortable with that, or otherwise please please say so explicitly in the chat if you are not comfortable with speaking your questions. Thank you. So Samira.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, excellent. So this is a question for Martina. I was wondering, so when you were talking about how the formulae were composed by trained poets and often varied orally, it reminded me a lot of when people talk about Old English literature and the fact that, you know, there is this debate about whether there really were trained shops, poets who performed orally, or whether it was all written down to mimic orality. And I was wondering if you'd looked at sort of how punctuation or manuscript layout might play a role in suggesting whether a text was originally innovated and then written down or originally written. I'm aware that ancient Greek texts aren't punctuated or necessarily, and they're mostly written in scripto continua, like continuous script. But I was wondering if you'd maybe like thought about how there were any indicators of whether you could tell from the layout of the page or from the earlier sources the extent to which something was written or innovated.
Yeah, thank you for this. The main problem here is the absolutely horrendous gap between composition and even the earliest, not even manuscripts, but traces of textualization that we have, which are in Hellenistic times. So we're talking, you know, 600 years between composition and when people are reflecting on how the text of Homer should be written. So I'm talking about Homer mainly. There's Hesiod, there's the hymns, but that's Homer is where we have stuff, essentially, where we have data. So part of what Hellenistic scholars do is think about that there's a lot of work on punctuation, actually, that we find in marginal notes to Homeric manuscripts. And all of it is geared towards, well, a lot of it is geared towards better performance. So, okay, you need a punctuation mark here because that's where you stop, because you want to emphasize the next word. And that's terribly interesting if you're looking at how these poems were performed in like the 2nd century BC, but it doesn't tell you much about how they were performed in the 7th century BC or the 8th century BC. So there is a lot of stuff there that I know very little about, but I don't think it says very much in terms of composition rather than later performance. But that said, I don't particularly care about composition because as Stephen has hinted, I also think it's a dead end. But it's in, like, you know, the evidence points either one way or the other, depending on how you look at it. But I think like there are so many more things to look at in the Scholia, in the marginal notes. Yeah. I think we have a follow-up question. I presume.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
So it's Ray.
Okay.
Ray
Martina, especially given your comments about the difficulty of the textual history, Ptolemaic papyri and so forth, how does that possibly undercut your conclusion? And the reason I ask that is when you were talking about all the variation in Homer, it was almost as you're talking about Homer as a single author compared to Apollonius. And I know that you didn't, obvious from your comments just then, that's not what you intended, but it could be interpreted that way. So if you have textual variation because you have multiple Homeric bards, is the variation because of, well, transmission more than composition, but I don't even like that distinction. Thank you.
Oh yes, thank you. Like that's a huge question, and obviously very interesting. That doesn't mean I'm gonna ignore it. That normally means I'm gonna ignore it. The amount of variation you expect the Homeric tradition to include, and to what stage, like to which stage in the tradition it was included, depends entirely on what kind of school you basically subscribe to. So the sort of Gregory Nage inspired American school mostly still thinks that there was a relatively significant amount of variation down to Hellenistic times, when in Hellenistic times, bunch of people, I'm probably saying obvious things, but a bunch of people sat down and decided to produce editions of the Homeric poems. These editions did not appear to differ immensely from one another when it came to their use of manuscript sources. They use manuscript sources, but we don't see a lot of traces of, okay, there's a wildly different variant here that this scholar chooses as opposed to the other scholar. So that actually doesn't seem, compared to what the sort of Nage side of the pond thinks, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of this kind of variation. We have some evidence of structural variation in terms of which episodes are included or not, if we trust it, because we don't have, I mean, we have some evidence, but it's very little. There's a very good article that was written about this, and I'm just gonna try and find it. And I'm obviously gonna fail at finding it. I'm just very simply looking at my bibliography database. I'll find it at some point and I'll just put it in the chat. But basically someone actually went through all the papyri in the 90s, it's not recent, and I was like, wait, there is actually very, very little variation in the text as it is transmitted. So this is less of a problem than it may seem there. And it's definitely not really a problem when we go down to Apollonius. Like Apollonius is very much thinking of one text, which is the Alexandrian edition, well, one of the Alexandrian editions on which our own text of Homer is based. So when we get to that stage, we're actually quite happy to say that the text of Homer that Apollonius received is kind of similar to what we received, to an extent that we can actually make relatively good comparisons. I hope that satisfies. I know there are a lot of questions, so I'm just...
Okay. So I think, well, thanks a lot. And well, if I may say something about this, I think we still need a really thorough study of the Hellenistic evidence to actually determine how much and what kind of variation we have, and we even miss a study of the indirect tradition of Homer in the 4th century authors like Plato. So Plato quotes a lot of Homer. What Homer did he have, right? So all of this is up for grabs, I would say. But without delving too deep into the Homeric question, I think we have a question from Tasha.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Martina and Stephen, for your really fascinating discussion. I'm not a classicist or a biblicist, so it was really great to get to hear about these different contexts. I don't have a question about any specific elements of the talk, but I was just wondering about your reflections after hearing each other's papers. So bearing interdisciplinarity in mind, if other people from other contexts are interested in studying oral formulae, what were your main gleanings you took away from your methodologies, and what would you suggest to people studying this from maybe like an Asian background or an African background?
That's a wonderful question. Would you like me to go first, Martina? It's fine. Yeah, that's well, the question, am I understanding, what did I take from Martina's work?
Kind of what patterns you noticed in your own methodology, how theirs compared to yours.
Yeah, Well,
yeah.
I was fascinated by Martina's use of, if I'm understanding right, it sounds like you're using construction grammar a bit.
Quite a bit, in fact, and I want to talk to you about that at some point. Yes.
Which is a wonderful sort of a sub-discipline within cognitive linguistics that I think holds immense potential for sorting out problems, and especially the study of ancient languages. And it has to do with the extent to which syntactic constructions themselves bring meaning to an expression. And that there's meaning in syntax. And of course, if you're familiar with the history of linguistic theory, that was sort of anathema to the generativist tradition. But within the cognitivist school, that syntax has meaning is a huge insight. And so of course would be significant for studying oral formula. What is the syntax of the formula, and how might you substitute a different word or an expression within a syntactic slot and still invoke the same idiom? And that's why, I think, early forays into this question hit a dead end, because they were being too narrow into what, in terms of, in their definition of what constitutes a formula. If you loosen those boundaries, and so I appeal to prototype theory, but construction grammar, which is, a somewhat related discipline, that holds immense potential for also answering the question. I imagine it would answer it somewhat similarly, but what it's saying in effect, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Martina, but thinking about how it applies to Hebrew is, you can bring meaning to a word through its placement within a larger syntactic construction, without having to load the semantics into the word itself. And so I realize that's probably painfully abstract. The example, I'm sure Martina is familiar with the work of Adele Goldberg, right? And her, I think it's her discussion of the word bake. Bake.
I don't actually know the bake example. I was most of the
I
examples
might be
used.
remembering.
But most of the examples I used were like, to be in hospital.
Right.
I'm less interested. I'm less interested in how words gain meaning from their context, and more in how the meaning actually seems to impose completely arbitrary restrictions on form. To be in the hospital or to be in school are very different concepts than to be in the hospital and to be in the school. That sort of thing is very hard to explain from a generative point of view, but works very well in construction grammar. And I've put a bunch, sorry, I'm just going to jump in here.
Yeah, please do, yeah.
A bunch of references in the chat so books and a PhD thesis that explore the idea of formulae as constructions, which I think is extremely versatile. I mean, the weak point of construction grammar is that it's extremely versatile. Pretty much everything ends up being a construction if you look at it in the right way. Which is the point, like that's the point. Everything is meant to be a construction, but it's extremely useful, I think. So to answer your question in a more direct way, Tasha, so I think where we would recommend to start is from the linguistic theory and the more approachable side of the linguistic theory, which is construction grammar and cognitive linguistics, rather than, Nagler is still working in a Chomskyan approach, and he's just like, Gestalts are pretty much like deep grammar. No, they're not. It's actually a disaster if you try to do that. So I put a couple of references. The Oral Poetics and Cognitive Science book is really interesting. The problem is the chapter on construction grammar does not reference this other thing that I put in the chat, which is a PhD thesis, which was actually the first to suggest that Homeric formulae actually work like constructions. They are constructions in a linguistic sense. And I think the authors simply just like were writing at the same time and they didn't read each other. So it's absolutely painful to read one and just not see the other, essentially. There isn't just construction grammar in that book, but that's the sort of thing that I would start with, just like the linguistic, because, good linguistics is actually meant to be on some level universal. So like to produce concepts that can be like applied that can tell you something if you apply them to a different language that's not English. And if not, then you're failing at it. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's where I would start.
That's a very good answer, thank you.
Right. I think now we have a question from Chauvin.
Hello, am I visible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Thank you both. These presentations were really fascinating. My question is for Martina. I was interested in how Stephen was telling us that the use of formulae in the Psalms has a function to evoke a traditional atmosphere or create a sacred context for the recitation of those texts. And I was wondering whether there's a parallel in the epic poems, and particularly whether the Hellenistic commentators that you mentioned say anything about the value of formulae, or whether they make a value judgment about it, and whether there's such a concept as cliche, or whether they would ever kind of criticize the use of repetition in the way that we would in a society which values originality. And then whether, on the other hand, it's seen as a positive thing in that it could also evoke a particular tradition.
Thank you. That's a great question, and it's actually like something I'm really interested in, how we can trace reception through marginal notes. So what we find in the Hellenistic tradition, like in the Hellenistic commentary tradition, for what little we have of it, is a mix of the two. So we find marginal notes that record things like, oh, there's a horrible repetition here. So Xenodotus, one specific Hellenistic scholar, didn't like the fact that whenever someone reports a speech by someone else, a lot of the time the entire speech is repeated. So there's a different level of repetition. And sometimes someone replies to this. When I see someone replies to this, a lot of Homeric scholia are structured in such a way that you get, you know, this person who is named said this thing. However, either I think, or others say, or we can say. So you don't get the name of whoever proposed the counter argument, which is absolutely maddening. But yeah, so the counterpoint that is proposed to this is often something like, but Homer repeats a lot of things. So there is some sense that repetition is a feature of Homeric style, but there isn't a huge sense that this is part of a traditional referentiality system, which is really interesting, of course, because then the question becomes, why did they not think about that? Essentially, I'm not an expert on Homeric scholia or in like the Hellenistic critical tradition. I just happen to know some things about it. So if anyone knows more than me and wants to jump in and be like, oh, that's completely not true, or you're missing an important part of the picture, please do, because it's not my specialism. I just find it really interesting. At some point, I would love to, you know, work on it, but not now.
Okay.
And by the way, thank you, Ray, for all the references in the chat. Those are really interesting.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Ray. I think I'm going to ask you for that piece. I think we have a question from Itai. That's how it's pronounced.
Hey, yeah, thank you very much.
Hello.
I'm Itai from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Firstly, thank you for the papers. They were amazing. I mean, I'm working on very similar subjects, just started my PhD. Stephen, I've read your paper intensively for writing my proposal, and it's been really helpful. I also work on the Psalms from a formulaic perspective and construction grammar, so it's really helpful. So I just wanted to ask you now, Stephen, I think Martina, you have said that the composition and orality you find is a dead end. So I would like to think, Stephen, I mean, you do use the word oral quite a lot in your paper, and but you seem to not really, you know, the methodology you use say that we don't actually care if it was actually composed orally or not, as long as it has the right aesthetic. So why do we still keep the word oral in our discussion?
Yeah, I think that it's helpful to describe the mode of conception, if not, though not the mode of composition. And that distinction by Osterreicher and many others since then, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Robert Miller on orality in ancient Israel. They'll retain the notion of orality, but they don't mean what I think Lord and Perry meant. But it has to do with the oral mode of conception that I think helps us distinguish it from literary modes of conception. And one of the chief ways it does that is by it means differently, if I could put it like that. It achieves its meaning differently than what you might think of as allusion or copying in modern or poetry that's produced in literate cultures.
So if I could just follow up, perhaps the
Yeah.
word traditional is just more accurate than oral.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. I'd have to think about that. That's
Okay.
possibly. I mean, I think traditional comes with its own connotations that
Oh, yeah.
that might not solve the matter, but possibly, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And I'll be glad to continue
best
speaking
wishes
about
on
this
that.
personally.
I mean, if I may just jump in on this, I'm not entirely going to bring Nando into this, but you know, it's really interesting if you sort of drop the oral from oral traditional. This becomes really interesting if you're looking at traditions that are less oral, but also very traditional.
Yeah.
Like the Akkadian tradition. So yeah, that's my dream PhD that I never got to do. So yes. It's like how you can recontextualize traditional in a culture that's based on scribal transmission. But yeah.
I mean, there was a work on formulaic languages is also on written material. You know, there's a really interesting work on the formulae of death notices in Germany over the 20th century. So I mean, that's definitely written. So I mean, we can just drop the oral and talk about formulaic literature and non-formulaic literature. Maybe, I don't know. It's just a thought I'm having.
Yes, you could.
I think it's a great thought. If I could just jump in real quick, but that does bring you into that world of construction grammar then, because what is an idiom but an oral, well, a formula that we use, you know, in language. You know, I hit the hay. You know, you kick the bucket. You know.
Yeah, but if I can say something here, I think I have been mentioned. Yeah, if you entirely drop the word oral, then you miss the performance part of of it, and I think what we all are aiming to do is to try and connect these repetition features to performance rather than composition, you know. And but that's not that easy when you don't have the sources for it. But we will be talking about that a bit more next week, when we will be tackling two traditions in which you do have this kind of sources precisely in the manuscript evidence, and that's going to be about Norman French in medieval times, and the Hebrew in the Masoretic texts. So again, in the Middle Ages. With that, I think it is just about time. I don't think we have any other questions here, but of course you are all most welcome to email our speakers, I think. And well, I think it has been great, and I'd like to thank everyone and say that we are collecting a bit of the references that have been sent in this chat, and we will circulate them. So please join me in thanking Martina and Stephen for two really cutting-edge talks about Homer and the Hebrew Bible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all
For having
very
us.
much.
Thank you for the very good questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.